Military barracks are designed to house the living. Row upon row of steel bunks, footlockers, and personal belongings create spaces where soldiers eat, sleep, and prepare for the uncertainties of combat. But what happens when those barracks stand empty, yet the sounds of human anguish continue to echo through their halls? From the abandoned training camps of World War II to the forward operating bases of Iraq and Afghanistan, military personnel have filed reports that challenge our understanding of what lingers in spaces where young men and women once prepared for war. These aren't stories of equipment malfunctions or structural settling. These are accounts of voices calling out in languages both foreign and familiar, footsteps pacing empty corridors, and screams that seem to emerge from the walls themselves. The reports share disturbing consistencies, always occurring during night hours, always in barracks that have been officially vacated, and always witnessed by personnel whose training had conditioned them to distinguish between genuine threats and false alarms. Military investigators have attributed these incidents to everything from atmospheric pressure changes to psychological stress reactions. Yet the accounts persist, filed by MPs conducting security rounds, maintenance crews working late shifts, and officers completing administrative duties long after lights out. Are these encounters the product of overtired minds processing the ambient sounds of military installations? Or do certain spaces retain echoes of the human suffering they once contained? Voices of those who passed through on their way to conflicts from which some would never return. In war, the boundaries between past and present blur until both exist simultaneously in the same contested space. Sometimes, what emerges from that temporal confusion carries messages that the living were never meant to hear. If you're new here and want more true accounts from the fog of war, consider subscribing. These stories need to be told. Now, let's step back to September 1945, where the echoes of liberation still haunted the Norman coast. The cigarette camps of post-war France were meant to be places of healing and transition. Camp Lucky Strike, sprawled across the windswept coast near Le Havre, processed thousands of American forces awaiting repatriation after VE Day. But among the regular combat troops scheduled for discharge, the camp also housed recently liberated prisoners of war and concentration camp survivors, men whose experiences had pushed them beyond the boundaries of normal human endurance. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 82nd Airborne had seen his share of combat, from Normandy to the Battle of the Bulge. Night security detail at Lucky Strike should have been routine compared to what he'd experienced in the hedgerows and frozen forests of Europe. His patrol route covered the sprawling complex of Quonset huts and temporary structures, including Section C, the barracks that had housed the most severely traumatized survivors until they could be transferred to better medical facilities. Section C had been evacuated for 3 days in September 1945, cleared for fumigation and heating repairs, while its former occupants received treatment elsewhere. The building stood empty, windows open to the salt air of the English Channel, their stripped bunks waiting for the next wave of personnel to process through the machinery of military bureaucracy. But on the night of September 22nd, O'Brien encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. From his letter to his wife Mary, written in the shaking handwriting of a man trying to make sense of the impossible. "Mary, I need to write this down because it's eating at me, and I can't talk to the other boys about it without sounding like I've lost my mind. You know I've seen plenty in this war. Normandy, Market Garden, the Bulge. But what happened last Tuesday night has me more rattled than any German artillery barrage. I was doing my rounds through Section C, the barracks where they'd been housing some of the fellows we pulled out of the camps in Germany. Real bad shape, most of them. The medical boys had moved them to better facilities, so these huts had been empty for 3 days while they fumigated and repaired the heating systems. Around 0200 hours, I was walking between huts 47 and 48 when I heard voices coming from inside 47. Not English, sounded like German, maybe Polish. At first I figured maybe some of the liberated boys had wandered back, looking for belongings they'd left behind. But when I checked the hut, it was completely empty. Bunks stripped bare, windows open for ventilation, yet I could still hear the voices. Dozens of them, like men having quiet conversations in the dark. Then the voices changed. They became desperate, crying, pleading. Some were calling out names in languages I couldn't understand. "Mary, I've heard men die. I know what that sounds like." But these voices weren't just crying. They were screaming, like they were reliving the worst moments of their lives, over and over. I stood outside that hut for 20 minutes, listening to sounds coming from an empty building. The Norman coast in September carried the complex atmosphere of a massive military operation winding down. Salt tang from the channel mixed with diesel fumes and the smoke of countless cigarettes, hence the camp's name. Fog rolled in from the water, creating pockets of visibility that could transform familiar paths into alien landscapes. The temporary structures groaned and settled in the coastal wind, but O'Brien knew the difference between structural sounds and human voices. What he heard that night defied every rational explanation his military training could provide. The strangest part was how familiar some of the voices sounded. Like I'd heard them before, during the processing interviews when these men first arrived. But the men I remembered were quiet, broken. These voices were full of pain that seemed too big for any one person to carry. Administrative records confirmed that Section C housed approximately 800 liberated prisoners between July and September 1945. Medical reports described severe psychological trauma among the survivors, men who had witnessed and endured experiences that military psychiatrists were only beginning to understand. The section was indeed evacuated on September 19th, exactly 3 days before O'Brien's encounter. But O'Brien's letter contained details he never shared with his commanding officers, details that revealed just how deeply the experience affected him. Mary, the worst part came when I finally worked up the courage to enter the hut. The voices stopped the moment I crossed the threshold, but the silence wasn't normal silence. It felt like dozens of people suddenly holding their breath, waiting for me to leave. I could swear I felt eyes watching me from every empty bunk. I stood there in that empty room for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The air was thick, heavy, like it was full of words that had never been spoken. When I finally left, the voices started again, but quieter now, like they were sharing secrets they didn't want me to overhear. If O'Brien's account is accurate, it suggests something profound about the nature of trauma and memory. Perhaps spaces that witness extreme human suffering retain echoes of that experience in ways our current understanding of reality cannot explain. The liberated prisoners who passed through Section C had survived the unspeakable, and maybe in some way, part of that survival continued long after they had moved on to other facilities. The bitter February of 1951 brought more than just New England snow to Camp Edwards, Massachusetts. As the Korean War escalated, the National Guard training facility processed thousands of reservists and draftees through accelerated combat preparation programs. The older barracks, hastily constructed during World War II, housed incoming personnel who would soon face the frozen battlefields of the Korean Peninsula. Corporal James Red Kowalski of the Military Police Detachment knew every building, every shadow, every normal sound that echoed through the camp during the quiet hours after lights out. His overnight security rounds had become routine over 6 months of duty, checking locks and ensuring that no one wandered where they weren't supposed to be. The irregular flow of personnel through the training pipeline meant that buildings were frequently vacated and reassigned, creating pockets of emptiness in the otherwise bustling facility. Building 23 had been empty for a week while maintenance crews repaired the heating system. The entire platoon had been relocated to newer barracks near the mess hall, leaving the older structure temporarily abandoned. For Kowalski, it was just another stop on his familiar route through the camp's sleeping quarters. But on the night of February 14th, 1951, Building 23 wasn't as empty as it was supposed to be. From Kowalski's diary, written in the careful handwriting of a man trying to document something he couldn't quite believe. Something happened tonight that I can't explain, and I'm not sure I want to. Been walking these same roads for 6 months, checking locks and making sure no one's where they're not supposed to be. Tonight was different. Building 23 has been empty for a week while they repair the heating system. Whole platoon got moved to the newer barracks near the mess hall. I was making my 300 rounds when I heard what sounded like someone having a nightmare in there. You know the sound, tossing, turning, maybe talking in their sleep. Figured maybe one of the boys had snuck back to grab something he'd forgotten. But when I unlocked the door and hit the lights, the barracks was empty. Every bunk stripped and stacked, personal gear all cleared out. Yet I could still hear it. Someone having a real bad dream. The Massachusetts winter had transformed Camp Edwards into a landscape of harsh contrasts. Wind off Cape Cod Bay cut through even the heaviest military clothing, while the older barracks fought a losing battle against drafts and humidity. The buildings retained the accumulated atmosphere of countless soldiers, boot polish, wool uniforms, and that particular mixture of nervousness and determination that characterized men preparing for combat. Kowalski stood in the empty barracks, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. The sound was coming from the middle of the room, around bunk 15. That's where they'd put Kowalski. Not me, different Kowalski. Polish kid from Chicago. Real quiet. Type. Kept to himself, mostly. He'd shipped out to Korea 3 days ago with the rest of his unit. I stood there listening to what sounded like someone reliving a firefight, muttering about incoming mortars, calling for medics, shouting warnings about Chinese positions. The voice. It sounded like young Kowalski, but he was halfway across the Pacific by now. Military records confirmed that Building 23 housed members of the 43rd Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion during January 1951, including Private First Class Stanley Kowalski, who deployed to Korea on February 11th, exactly 3 days before Corporal Kowalski's encounter. The building's heating system did require extensive repairs during mid-February, necessitating the temporary relocation of all assigned personnel. But the most disturbing aspect of the incident was yet to come. Then the nightmare sounds changed. Instead of combat stress, it became something else. Crying, like a kid calling for his mother. The sound was so real I almost answered, tried to wake him up, but there was nobody there to wake up. I stayed until the sound stopped around 03:30. Left that building feeling like I'd witnessed something private, something I wasn't meant to see, like I'd been listening to a conversation between a man and his fears. Kowalski's diary included one additional entry, written the following morning after he'd had time to process what he'd experienced. Checked the casualty reports from Korea today. Nothing official yet, but scuttlebutt is that the 43rd hit heavy resistance near Seoul. They're saying the 2nd Battalion took significant losses. I keep thinking about those sounds from Building 23, wondering if I was hearing an echo of something that hadn't happened yet, or something that was happening right then, halfway around the world. The implications of Kowalski's account are deeply unsettling. If his experience was genuine, it suggests that certain spaces might resonate with the emotional experiences of those who pass through them, regardless of time and distance. Building 23 had processed hundreds of young men through their final weeks on American soil. And perhaps, in some inexplicable way, it retained a connection to their fates long after they had shipped overseas. Forward Operating Base. Anaconda sprawled across the Iraqi desert 50 miles north of Baghdad, a small American city carved from sand and concrete in the heart of a war zone. As a major logistics hub and medical center for coalition forces throughout central Iraq, the base processed a constant flow of personnel through various phases of deployment, rotation, and casualty evacuation. The transient barracks housed soldiers awaiting transport, medical clearance, or reassignment, temporary residence in a temporary world where nothing felt permanent except the heat and the distant sound of helicopters. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos of the 95th Military Police Battalion had walked these routes for months, maintaining security in areas of the base that operated on skeleton crews during the overnight hours. August 2005 brought temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees during the day, with nights offering little relief from the oppressive heat. The base ran on a 24-hour cycle of controlled chaos, but certain buildings periodically emptied when personnel numbers fluctuated due to rotations and medical evacuations. Building 47 served as transient housing for soldiers in limbo, some heading home after completing their tours, others waiting for medical evaluation, still others being reassigned to different units or locations within the theater of operations. The constant turnover meant that Santos rarely saw the same faces twice, but she'd grown familiar with the rhythms of temporary residence, late-night conversations, homesick phone calls, and the particular kind of restless energy that came from living in a state of perpetual transition. But during the week of August 21, 2005, Building 47 stood completely empty due to an early rotation cycle and increased medical evacuations. Santos's patrol route included regular security checks of the vacant facility, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel had taken shelter in the temporarily abandoned space. What she encountered there would challenge her understanding of what lingered in places where people had shared their deepest fears and most private hopes. From her email to her sister Rosa, sent on August 23, 2005. Rosa, I need to tell someone about what's been happening here, and I can't put this in any official report without sounding like I've lost it. You know I'm not the type to believe in ghost stories, but something's going on in Building 47 that I can't explain. It's one of the transient barracks, houses guys who are rotating through for various reasons. Some heading home, some waiting for medical clearance, some getting reassigned. The building gets emptied out periodically when we have low numbers, which happened this week due to a bunch of early rotations and medical evacuations. The Iraqi desert at night created its own atmosphere of isolation. FOB Anaconda operated as a pool of artificial light in an ocean of darkness, where harsh fluorescent illumination gave way to deep shadows at the edges of the civilized world. The air carried a constant mixture of dust, diesel fuel, and the metallic smell of generators running around the clock. Night security patrols move through corridors of light and shadow, where familiar daytime spaces transformed into something alien and potentially threatening. I was doing my rounds Tuesday night around 0200 when I heard what sounded like someone having a conversation in 47. Not unusual. Sometimes guys can't sleep and they'll talk quietly so they don't wake their bunkmates. But when I looked through the windows, all the lights were off and I couldn't see anyone moving around. I used my master key to check inside. Rosa, the building was completely empty. All the bunks were stripped, personal gear cleared out, even the vending machines had been unplugged. Yet I could still hear voices, multiple people having what sounded like serious conversations. Santos paused outside the empty building, listening to voices that shouldn't exist, coming from rooms that contained no people to speak them. The strangest part was that some of the voices sounded familiar. There was one that reminded me of Specialist Martinez, who'd been medevac to Germany 3 days earlier after an IED incident. Another sounded like Sergeant Williams, who'd completed his rotation and flown out Monday morning. Administrative records confirmed that Building 47 was indeed vacant during August 21st to 25th, 2005, following a scheduled rotation cycle. Medical evacuation logs from the period show increased activity due to escalating insurgent attacks throughout the Balad region, including the IED incident that wounded Specialist Martinez and resulted in his immediate medical evacuation to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. But Santos's email contained details that transformed her experience from mysterious to genuinely horrifying. But it wasn't just conversation. As I stood there listening, the voices became more agitated. I heard someone crying, someone else praying in Spanish, and what sounded like a man dictating a letter to his family. The emotional intensity was so strong I felt like I was intruding on private moments. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice I recognized as belonging to Private Collins, who died in a mortar attack 2 weeks ago, was talking about being scared to go home, about not knowing how to explain what he'd seen over here to his family. Rosa, Collins never made it home. He was killed before his rotation ended, but I swear I heard his voice in that empty barracks, talking about fears he'll never get the chance to address. The implications of Santos's account reached beyond simple supernatural explanation into something more profound about the nature of unfinished business and unresolved emotions. Transient barracks, like Building 47, served as repositories for the private thoughts and concerns of soldiers, processing through some of the most emotionally intense experiences of their lives. They witnessed conversations about home, family, fears, and hopes. All the human elements that military training attempted to manage, but could never fully contain. Santos's email concluded with a detail that haunted her for years afterward. Rosa, the worst part wasn't hearing Colin's voice. It was realizing that all the voices I heard sounded like they were having conversations they never got the chance to have, saying things they needed to say, but ran out of time for. Like that empty barracks was somehow holding on to all the words that got left unspoken when people left too quickly or didn't leave at all. If Santos's experience was genuine, it suggests that certain spaces become saturated with human emotion to a degree that transcends our understanding of how memory, place, and consciousness interact. As the Iraq War wound down in 2009, Camp Liberty near Baghdad International Airport served as a major staging area for American forces transitioning through various phases of deployment and redeployment. The facility's IT infrastructure supported thousands of personnel communicating with family members back home, processing administrative requirements, and maintaining the digital connections that kept military operations functioning across multiple time zones. Technical Sergeant David Chen of the Air Force Communications Squadron spent his nights maintaining the base's network systems, often working alone in buildings that had been temporarily vacated for equipment upgrades or personnel rotations. The work required complete system shutdowns, meaning entire buildings would be cleared of all personnel, while Chen upgraded servers and network hardware that supported everything from official communications to personal email and video calls home. Building 12 housed transient personnel awaiting redeployment to the United States, soldiers completing combat tours, support staff rotating between assignments, and medical personnel transitioning between different facilities within the theater. The building's network infrastructure supported the constant digital communications that helped these transitioning personnel maintain connections with families and process the complex emotions of leaving a war zone. But on the night of March 15, 2009, while conducting a routine network upgrade in the supposedly empty building, Chen encountered something that challenged his understanding of how digital systems interact with human experience. From his instant message conversation with a colleague logged in the military's internal communication system. Chen: "Dude, something weird happened. Last night during the network upgrade in Building 12. Chen: Place was supposed to be completely empty while I worked on the servers, but kept hearing what sounded like guys talking in the next room. Chen: Thought maybe someone had stayed behind, so I checked every room. Totally empty. but I could still hear voices coming through the walls. The server room environment created its own microclimate within the desert base. Air conditioning units fought against Iraq's heat, while banks of blinking equipment cast colored shadows across empty corridors. The building retained the institutional atmosphere of military housing. Disinfectant, industrial carpet, and the lingering presence of thousands of temporary residents who had passed through its rooms and common areas. Chen's maintenance work should have been routine. Complete shutdown of all network systems, physical replacement of server hardware, and systematic testing of restored connections. The building had been officially cleared of all personnel, with residents temporarily relocated to other facilities while the upgrade was completed. But as Chen worked alone in the server room, surrounded by banks of humming equipment, he began to hear voices from areas of the building that should have been completely vacant. Chen, here's the really strange part. Some of the voices sounded like they were reading emails or letters out loud, could hear fragments about missing home, being scared, telling family members they loved them. Chen. One voice kept repeating what sounded like a goodbye message, over and over. Same words, same inflection, like a recording stuck on loop. Its maintenance logs confirmed that Building 12 underwent network infrastructure upgrades during March 12th to 16th, 2009, requiring complete evacuation of all personnel. The building had previously housed personnel awaiting redeployment, including soldiers who had used the facility's communication systems extensively to maintain contact with family members during their final weeks in Iraq. Chen's description of voices reading emails or letters out loud suggests something more complex than simple auditory hallucinations. The building's network infrastructure had processed thousands of personal communications, video calls with spouses and children, emails describing combat experiences, and digital messages attempting to bridge the gap between war zone realities and civilian life back home. Chen. But the building was empty, man. Checked 3 times. All the computers were shut down for the upgrade. No way anyone could have been there. Chen. The really messed up part was when I realized some of the email fragments I was hearing matched messages I'd helped guys send home during previous rotations. Like the building somehow recorded their last communications and was playing them back. Chen's final observation raises profound questions about how modern military facilities might interact with the digital communications that flow through their systems. If his account is accurate, it suggests that networks which process emotionally intensive communications might retain some form of residual trace, digital echoes of human experience that persist even after the systems themselves have been shut down. From post-war Europe to the global war on terror, soldiers in empty barracks have reported the same impossible thing: voices where no one lived anymore. Conventional logic points to settling buildings, pressure changes, or the stressed minds of men working alone. But the patterns go deeper than creaks and groans. Witnesses hear full conversations, prayers in the dark, and even the voices of comrades who had recently departed, or already died. Barracks are not just walls and bunks. They're containers of human fear, longing, and unfinished words whispered in the night. Perhaps what lingers isn't random noise, but the echoes of those unresolved moments, memories too heavy to vanish with the soldiers who carried them. The barracks may stand empty, their bunks stripped bare and their occupants scattered across time and geography, but the voices remain, speaking words that were never finished, sharing fears that were never resolved, and calling out to families they may never see again. If you're still listening in the darkness, tap like and subscribe for more true accounts from the fog of war. These stories deserve to be remembered. These stories are presented as submitted accounts and military reports. Interpretations may vary. All witness testimonies are presented as claimed by original sources,